I am Ashanti Edwards, the Director for Professional Development at the American Society for Cell Biology. We are pleased to offer Online with LSC as a part of ASCB's Professional Development webinar series. Today, our facilitator, Dr. Paul Lee, will be introducing our featured author for this installment of Online with LSC. Paul, you can turn your camera on now.
Thank you, Ashanti, and I wanted to welcome everyone to this session of Online with LSE. I wanted to remind the audience that the goal of this webinar is that it's supposed to be a virtual journal club to provide a behind-the-scene insights to different education studies. I also wanted to strongly encourage everyone to submit questions as we go. So please feel free to make active use of the Q&A feature that you can find at the bottom of Zoom. We will synthesize questions and make them visible as we go. Now what I wanted to do was introduce Dr. Sarah Brunell. Sarah Brunell is an associate professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. She is a biology education researcher who explores how to create more inclusive undergraduate biology learning environments for women, students with disabilities, religious students, and LGBTQ+ students. She is also a proud recipient of the 2020 LGBTQ+ Educator of the Year Award from the National Organization of Gay and Lesbian Scientists and Technical Professionals. And with that, welcome, Sarah, to Online with LSE.
Great, thank you, Paul. So welcome everyone. I'm really excited that you've chosen to take an hour out of your busy summer schedules to come and join and ask questions about this article. So this is a little bit of a different article compared to a lot that have been featured. In that I am really just the representative from a really large group of authors. So this article first initiated at the Society for the Advancement of Biology Education Research meeting a few years ago. We started a special interest group for LGBTQ+ individuals. We met at that meeting and basically just started talking through some of our experiences in biology environments, some of the challenges that we've experienced. And Kara Gormali actually came up with the idea, well, what if we put together some kind of resource that could be used by folks in the biology community that could help make spaces in biology more inclusive, thinking about classroom spaces, thinking about conference spaces, thinking about undergraduate lab spaces, graduate lab spaces, et cetera. And so here's the broader team of folks who are part of this project. It started with a group of folks who came to the initial SABR meeting, and then we used our networks and our connections to invite in other folks. We represent basically every type of institution, all kinds of different ranks and positions, and a wide variety of different identities along the LGBTQ+ spectrum. And so the point of today, most of what we're going to do is have you ask questions, but I wanted to go through the 14 recommendations that our group came up with. The first set of recommendations centers around language, that language really matters. So LGBTQ+ tends to be the acronym that folks use, but there's some folks who are not familiar with this acronym that kind of make jokes about how many letters it is or how hard it is to remember the letters. And that can be really offensive for LGBTQ+ individuals. So our first recommendation is just learn this acronym, learn what it entails, and use the term appropriately, and don't make jokes about kind of how we keep adding additional letters because really there's different identities within this spectrum that are represented. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, plus to include various identities there. Also learn the specific vocabulary around the LGBTQ+ identity. So this is something where terms change over time. Terms that were used 20 years ago are now potentially considered offensive. Terms that were offensive 20 years ago have now been reclaimed by the community. So a good example of this is the term queer. It originated as really a slur for LGBTQ+ individuals, and now the community has reclaimed this, and a lot of folks identify as queer as their primary LGBTQ+ identity. We put forth recommendations to create opportunities for people to share their identity, to foster safe environments for individuals to reveal their LGBTQ identities, and whether that might mean in some conferences, and I know ASCB does this, you might have a rainbow tag that you can put on your conference badge. You might highlight in a class that this is an inclusive class and people should feel free to bring their whole identity to the class. Be careful not to assume the gender or partner preferences of individuals. So if someone hasn't revealed their identity to you, unfortunately in society, we often assume that people are cisgender and or straight. And so we often make assumptions about who their partner might be. And so using gender neutral language can be really important. Create opportunities for individuals to choose to reveal their pronouns and names. In a space like Zoom, you can put in parentheses at the end of your name to rename yourself and include your pronouns. Some instructors choose to use name tents in the classroom. You can have students write their pronouns on their name tents, so that can be a way of revealing that. In the very beginning of a class, you can have students whip around the room and actually share out their name and their pronoun. I will say it shouldn't be their preferred pronoun, it's actually just their pronoun, because preference implies that it's a choice, and really it's the pronoun that they want to use. We also talked about meaningfully advocate for the LGBTQ plus community. So as people are meaningfully advocating, especially allies, you might make mistakes. And in fact, a number of years ago, I made a mistake by misgendering a transgender student in my class. I felt terrible, but I took that as an opportunity to learn a lot more about transgender students and being more thoughtful with my teaching about how I could try to prevent misgendering in the future. If you make a mistake, don't kind of blow it out of proportion. Just, you can quickly apologize and then really try to make sure that you're not going to make that mistake again in the future. You can overtly support the LGBTQ community. There are programs that are available for folks to learn more about this community, including something like this, but at your campus, there might be safe zone trainings that you can participate in to get more familiar with this community. And you can actually sometimes get like a sticker that you can put on the board on your office to highlight that you're supportive of this community. You can familiarize yourself with LGBTQ plus community and campus resources. In case someone comes with you with a challenge or a problem, you can point them to an organization on your campus or in your community. We can also create inclusive biology classrooms, right? So many of these recommendations would be true of any classroom, but some of these recommendations are actually specific to biology because there's a potential intersection between LGBTQ identity and biology content. So we want to be thoughtful about the use of humor and pop culture in the classroom. So studies have shown that LGBTQ individuals can be more offended about certain use of humor, and be thoughtful about pop culture, especially if this pop culture comes from 10, 20, 30 years ago when it was far more socially appropriate to make derogatory comments about LGBTQ individuals in movies and TV shows, et cetera. You can present LGBTQ plus role models in science, highlighting, because this is a concealable or invisible identity, you often have to make it explicit to folks that someone identifies this way. And this can help students realize that if they identify as members of the LGBTQ community, that they can also go on and be successful scientists. Discussing the full range of gender and sexuality in biology class, often we assume that humans are straight when we're doing crossing in genetics, when we're doing Punnett squares, right? And so be really thoughtful about our language, the use of the term parents, the terms we use around mating. And then incorporate positive and well-rounded examples of LGBTQ identity into the curriculum. So often the only time LGBTQ identity is mentioned is in a negative context. And so be thoughtful about actually incorporating it more in a positive way. And then finally, our last two recommendations were specifically for biology education researchers and people doing research in this area. Be inclusive of LGBTQ plus individuals when designing surveys for biology education research, right? If you're asking about whether your parent went to college to find out if a student is a first generation student or not, use parent, right? As opposed to mom or dad. Some people have two moms and no dads. Some people have two dads and no moms, right? It's also important sometimes if you're trying to if you're trying to collect gender identity, don't just include woman and man as the two options. Also include an option for gender non-binary, or even a write-in option for a student to write in their own identity that they most closely identify with. And then advocate for LGBTQ plus inclusive language in publications. So they, them has been considered fairly recently as a singular pronoun. But I know that for many of the authors on this particular paper, when we've tried to submit to journals, sometimes they, them gets replaced with he, she. And that's not going to be inclusive for LGBTQ individuals who identify as gender non-binary. And so advocating and really pushing back if people change that language to make sure the language is appropriate. So same thing would be true if you're measuring gender as opposed to sex. Be careful whether you're using the terms man, woman versus female, male. So with that, those are our 14 recommendations. I will say that they weren't meant to be kind of exhaustive. It was the 14 recommendations that this group came up with through a series of brainstorming exercises. And we know that as the years go on, we'll want to continue to kind of change and modify and refine these recommendations. But this can be a really good start for folks if they're interested in becoming more inclusive of these individuals. And then my final plug that I want to do real quickly is a team that stemmed from this group just received an NSF grant to study the impact of LGBTQ plus and STEM instructors coming out in class. So if you identify as someone who is part of the LGBTQ community and you teach undergraduates, if you'd be interested in helping us out, we would have stipends available for you to do this. We're really interested in looking at the impact on your students for actually explicitly coming out in class. And there's a QR code that you can look at. And with that, I will go ahead and stop sharing my slides and we'll start chatting.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that overview of your essay. Again, I wanted to make sure to encourage everyone to submit questions via the Q&A. And while everyone kind of gets their thoughts together, I actually have a few questions emailed to me ahead of time. So I'd like to start off with this question. This essay includes a diverse range of authors with varying experiences and histories. What were some of the benefits of having a large author team, and what were some of the challenges in making this essay?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Paul. That was that's a really important question. So there's actually been very little systematic research done looking at the experiences of LGBTQ individuals, specifically in the context of academic biology, but even across STEM, there's really just a handful of studies. And so because of that, we wanted to make this as evidence-based as possible. We went and looked in the literature. So the very first step that our research team did was we sent people off to look for any publications, and we had kind of a dump of a bunch of publications. And what we realized was a lot of the recommendations we wanted to make, there was no empirical studies that really were available to back this up, but so many of us had these experiences. So drawing from our own personal experiences was really important. We had folks who had international experiences. They provided kind of a completely different perspective than folks who have grown up in the United States. We had folks who identify as transgender. They had obviously a very different experience than, for example, if someone identifies as bisexual. And so having that large author team was really critical to help counteract some of our own biases. And you'll see if you go and check out the essay, in some cases, we couldn't even actually decide as a group on some of the recommendations. And so we tried to highlight in some cases some of the nuance.
Thank you for that. The next question that I have is, what's a relatively neutral pronoun to use when you don't know someone's pronouns and can't easily ask them? Should you use they, or is there a better choice?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would recommend probably using they, them to be kind of as inclusive as possible. A lot of folks who identify as a woman that use she, her pronouns, if you referred to them just as they, them in the beginning, that would probably be fine. So I would probably recommend to start off with they, them, especially if it's a larger setting where you don't necessarily know their pronouns. That's going to be safer than potentially misgendering that individual.
And the next question that I have in Q&A is, do you have specific suggestions for a way to make a syllabus more LGBTQ plus inclusive?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So because this is so there's two factors at play. Because this is a concealable identity, often, you look at someone, you may suspect that they're a member of the LGBTQ community, but because it's historically and still in some situations currently stigmatized, you might be really hesitant to assume that someone is a member of this community, and you may default to thinking that they're straight. So because of that, it often just gets erased from situations, right? And so LGBTQ students may just not see themselves kind of present at all in the syllabus, in the class, et cetera. Also, because of the connection between kind of LGBTQ identity and the kind of emphasis on sexual orientation or sexual identity or sex in general, there's often this kind of stigma that it's something that's inappropriate to talk about. Now, there's a huge push to actually move away from the term sexual orientation or sexual identity, because this identity encompasses far more than just sex. And in fact, some individuals who identify as asexual, they may have romantic relationships that don't actually involve kind of any kind of sexual identity. So again, using the term LGBTQ identity is the most inclusive. As far as a syllabus, you can, instead of having the erasure of LGBTQ individuals, you can actually be explicit about it in your syllabus. So I would recommend having a section on your syllabus about building an inclusive classroom and actually calling out, right, that you want to be inclusive for students with disability, that you want to be inclusive for LGBTQ students, right, that you want to be inclusive for first generation students, right, and actually include that identity so then it doesn't get forgotten.
Another question that we have, I have struggled with inclusive language in teaching genetics and hereditary, particularly in terms of pedigrees for introductory classes. Do you have any suggestions for language, and in particular, meeting students where they are in biologically accurate and inclusive terms?
Yeah, so we touch on this in the essay, but we don't go into it in detail. There's actually another article, an essay that was published in CBLSE a couple of years ago that gets into specifically genetics and how you can teach it in a way that's more inclusive for various gender identities and LGBTQ identities. I think first and foremost, I think it's super important to not make assumptions. And I think it's important to even, when we've talked to students, even having some kind of disclaimer before you teach the material can be really helpful, and it can make them feel seen and appreciated in the context. So you might say that, it's really important to highlight that not every person is cisgender and is straight, right? But we are going to make some assumptions when we're teaching genetics, but it's important to realize that there's a huge spectrum, right? Now you can actually get into really interesting examples, right? Not just with humans, but also with other animals, right? That of different species that, change genders throughout their life, right? Or that have, different mating platform or mating behaviors, and right. And so you could highlight those examples, but if you don't feel like you have enough time for that, at the very least, give some a kind of disclaimer at the very beginning. Another thing that I would encourage you to do is think twice about whether you're using a human example, right? So when you're using human examples, you also have the challenge of integrating social constructs that we have of gender, right? Which can complicate things. And so maybe instead of using that human example, use an example of a different species.
And to follow up with that in a more general sense, what are recommendations that you have on establishing inclusive norms in the classroom that are LGBTQ supportive? I know that you talked about a few in your essay, but if you had anything else.
So I would recommend that you start off your first day of class talking about how you want to create an inclusive space, and that people have different identities and that we want to respect people's identities. And you can highlight that, more diverse perspectives can often make discussion and science better, right? Because you're coming in, you're counteracting each other's biases. So I would be very explicit at the very beginning of class. I do this in my classes to highlight that we are going to bring our identities, and it's okay to share our identities. Another thing that I do is actually the very first week when I teach a large enrollment class, I send to students a survey that basically asks them a bunch of questions about different identities that they hold, including LGBTQ identity. So I asked them about whether they commute. I asked them about whether they're working a job. I asked them about their career interests. I asked them about their current major. And so it helps me get a snapshot for the class as a whole, but it's also helping me to get a sense for what percentage of my students identify as LGBTQ, what percentage of my students identify as religious, what percentage of my students are community college transfer students, right? And these identities, which otherwise would be invisible if I'm just looking out at my students, this is really helpful for me to think about how can I craft my content in a way to be potentially more inclusive of those individuals, right? And I think it also, and we've collected some data from students where we've asked them, we've asked you a bunch of personal questions. And I will say every question, make it so that students don't have to actually answer. And so don't force them to answer, and give them the option of actually do not want to answer. So that way, if they're struggling with their identity, if they're still trying to figure it out, if they're uncomfortable kind of clicking a box, then that becomes more comfortable for them. But this process, we've talked to students, helps them feel like I actually care about their identity, and that it normalizes this process of revealing their identity, and it makes them feel like they don't have to hide this part of who they are. And then if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, we've done a study where we've actually looked at whether LGBTQ biology instructors come out to their students, and we see different patterns where there's some individuals who come out, there's some individuals who don't come out. And something that emerged from that study, which was really interesting, was the majority of people who don't come out, they're not coming out because they don't necessarily see the positives of coming out, but it seems like the folks who do come out, they are articulating what they feel like are the positives for coming out, not just for themselves individually as far as living more authentically, but also being potential role models and mentors for students in their classes. And so if you identify as a member of the LGBTQ community, I would encourage you to think, and obviously this is a personal decision, but at least to think twice about whether you want to come out and be that role model for students. And people do this in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes people do it by putting a LGBTQ rainbow sticker on their water bottle and so they do it in kind of a very subtle way. I actually come out to students my very first day of class when I tell them kind of who I am. I tell them I like to hike, I tell them I like Chipotle, and I tell them I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ community. So it takes all of 3 seconds to do, and that way, and then I don't come back to it at all. But if students then want to come talk to me, they have that option. I've made that identity visible.
Thank you for sharing. Another question that's popped up. So this paper was written through a biology discipline lens. How may these recommendations be applied to additional science contexts, such as chemistry and physics, for example?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I would say the vast majority of the recommendations would be applicable to any classroom and any STEM classroom. So some of the specifics as far as, how do you teach genetics or how do you teach reproduction, that's going to be more specific to a biology context. But otherwise, as far as, making it normal that you share pronouns at the beginning of a class, making your class an inclusive class, being inclusive as far as LGBTQ individuals in your publications, that would be true regardless of the discipline. I will point out that studies have shown that STEM disciplines tend to be more kind of chilly and less friendly spaces for LGBTQ individuals. So students are far more likely to have humanities or social science faculty share their identities than they are to have STEM faculty share their identities. And part of this rationale, and Erin Chesh has done some of this work, has highlighted that because in science, we often think of science as being this completely objective enterprise, even though we know that that's not true, we feel like we can't bring identities into the conversation. So as a result, people tend to leave their identities outside of the research lab, outside of the classroom.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that, understanding that social climate is so important whenever it comes to LGBTQ plus inclusivity. Along those lines, there's a question here. I've experienced some pushback when I have included demographic questions to include non-binary and transgender options in STEM education. What rationale is there for including this information on surveys and capturing this information?
Yeah, so that's, I think, a really good question. I think the best rationale is that some of your students do not identify as man or woman, right? They identify as gender non-binary. And so by only limiting them to be able to click those two boxes, you're not accurately capturing who your students' gender identities are, right? And so, I think that there's a lot of resources, including this one, that you can point to in terms of the most inclusive way to write a survey is to include that gender non-binary option. If you do get pushback, and I'm not sure who you're getting pushback from, whether it's people taking the survey or whether it's other folks in your department, but if it's people taking the survey, I think something that might be helpful is, as a preamble to the survey, highlight that, you're collecting this demographic information in a way to help understand this population, right? And so, and I've actually found that sometimes, especially LGBTQ individuals who have been discriminated against, sometimes they feel like this information is being collected to target them in some way, right? And so being very explicit about, we're trying to collect this demographic information to basically help create more inclusive spaces, right? To better understand students' experience. I think that could help. But I think that the simplest answer to pushback is it's just not accurate if you're just collecting two genders.
Yeah, thank you. And for this question too, I've experienced something pretty similar. So what I've done in future the surveys that I've given is just leave it as a write-in option so that students can write in their specific gender identity, etc. And I don't get that pushback as much.
Yeah. And I will say, one thing to build onto for surveys, unfortunately, especially if you're doing, quantitative work, what ends up happening is you actually often end up not having enough students who identify as gender non-binary to be able to say anything meaningfully statistically with that population of students. And so often they're removed from the analyses. But I think something that's super important is even if you do that, right, you're in an essence erasing them from your study. It's really important in the methods to talk about that you did collect this information, to highlight that there are not just two genders, right, and to highlight that they were removed, because the sample size was too low. And I think that also means that there's a greater need for more qualitative work to explore the experiences of non-gender binary individuals in these spaces, because we're not able to often do this with quantitative studies or more national studies, right, where we're able to get a population size that we can look at.
The next question that I have here is, of the spectrum of methods of coming out to students, is there anything known about the most impactful and or useful methods for coming out to students?
That is such a great question. And that's that's part of why we're really excited about having this NSF funding to be able to look at this in a more systematic level. So right now, there's actually no studies at all that look at the impact of an LGBTQ instructor revealing their identity and the impact on students. There's studies that have basically looked at how it affects course evaluations, and there's mixed data on that. Some have shown that actually course evaluations can go down if people reveal that they're a member of the LGBTQ community. Others haven't found kind of an effect. And that obviously can also change with time and geographic area. There's also been some work that has been done looking at the impact on that instructor themselves, feeling more authentic by sharing. But really, there's very little work on the impact of students. Right now, I have a research team that we're in the process of looking at this with a population of students. We're starting to see some positive impacts on students, not actually just LGBTQ students, but actually a broader set of students in our class that is normalizing this identity. And this is relevant for them that have friends and family who are members of the LGBTQ community. So to answer your question, we don't know. I think it would be really important to explore. Often I would say, the common ways that people come out is they come out by sharing something about a significant other or partner. They might talk about it in the context of something specific, especially in biology classes, or they might come out just in that kind of intro to who they are. When we interviewed biology instructors, something that they brought up with as a concern for coming out is that maybe it takes too much time. But the vast majority of people who tend to come out, it tends to be actually really quick. So it's not going to necessarily take away from class time if you can do it fairly quickly, but there is also a little bit of awkwardness, like how do you kind of interject it into a conversation? And that's where people feel, I think, most comfortable sharing it at the very beginning when they're trying to kind of present themselves as a person and a human and kind of about who they are as the instructor.
What is known about coming out to a class with a large portion of religious students, such as Christian and Muslim students? Are there studies on this, and how does it affect student-professor dynamics?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There are no published studies on this. You know, we've done some work on LGBTQ plus students in biology classrooms being worried about religious students maybe not accepting them. And they've talked actually explicitly about coming into class the very first day and trying to almost scan the class. And if anyone's wearing any kind of overt religious cross or you know, or if they're wearing anything that makes it look like that person is more religious, then they purposely don't sit next to that person. And they're like, I know that not every religious individual is not going to be tolerant of my identity, but it's just not worth the risk if I'm stuck with someone for the entire class. So this is definitely a concern for LGBTQ individuals. We have preliminary data when we've looked at religious students in a class where an instructor has come out. We don't see kind of a negative effect. We've asked students whether they think it's appropriate for an instructor to come out, and overwhelmingly students feel like it's appropriate. Like over 95% of students feel like it's appropriate. Even when we look at those religious students, the majority of them feel like it's fine to reveal. Now, that is in the context of a public institution. I don't know what that would look like at a really conservative religious institution, right? And we know from some of the studies done on LGBTQ individuals at religious institutions, they can actually be fired for revealing their identity, right? And so that's going to be a very different context.
The next question that I have here in the Q&A is in terms of, so sexual orientation on a survey often gets struck down, and how do I convince people to let me have it in there?
Yeah, so again, I wouldn't call it sexual orientation because I do, again, some people use that term. I personally have a strong preference against that term just because of that emphasis on sex, and it almost sounds dirty, and it's something that you're collecting about students that you shouldn't be collecting, right? If you instead say, what is your LGBTQ plus identity? Or you can say something like, do you identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus identity? Yes or no? I think that might be a way further. Again, I would wonder who's striking that down and who's pushing back on that. And just highlighting, you know, the experiences of LGBTQ students. We know it's a minoritized, marginalized identity. We know, so there's work from Bryce Hughes that highlights that LGBTQ plus students are more likely to not persist in STEM compared to non-LGBTQ plus students. So these are a population of students that we want to look at their experiences, right? It's an identity just like any other identity. And so again, I think we have to change that dialogue, and people can't feel like we can't ask these questions, because if we don't even know who identifies this way, then how can the people who identify this way actually feel comfortable?
This next question is more focused on the faculty side, but how can we as faculty better advocate to our faculty senates and university administrations to increase support for the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it's a challenge at a lot of institutions, because if we look at faculty diversity, often institutions look at gender and they look at race, ethnicity, and that's it, right? And they're not collecting data on LGBTQ identity. They're not collecting data on, right, just any, you know, often they're not even collecting data on disability status, right? So, so I would advocate for universities and departments to begin to collect more of that data, to begin to look at that. I know that at least some departments are starting to look at LGBTQ identity when they're looking at faculty candidates as a way to help diversify their faculty, that you know, someone coming in who identifies as an LGBTQ individual will potentially teach in a different way, will potentially connect with students in a different way, right? And this could potentially change the demographics of who's in science. I don't know if LGBTQ individuals are underrepresented in science. That also goes back to a challenge of the National Science Foundation doesn't collect this information. And there's a group of individuals that's really pushing right now to try to get NSF to begin to collect this information. So again, I think part of the problem is just we're not collecting this information. So we don't even know whether people are underrepresented or not. In terms of advocating for LGBTQ individuals and programs and support, June is Pride Month. This is, I think, a nice timely excuse to send your deans, to send chairs, messaging about how we can be more inclusive of LGBTQ individuals. I think sending the article that was published in Science Advances by Bryce Hughes showing that LGBTQ students are not persisting at the same rates, that could be compelling for administrators, right? If they're thinking about potentially losing students. And I think it's really important that there have been real generational shifts, right? So folks who are 60 years old, they had a very different experience and exposure to LGBTQ individuals than our current population of students who are, the average college student is, 20, 25 years old, right? So the generational shift and just the changes both legally and just socially in terms of acceptance, in terms of far greater role models on TV and in movies, right? This means that our students want different things because they're a very different population of students, right?
The next question here is there a best way to form groups of students so that students can feel comfortable when working with others? I am worried about making class terrible because someone has to work with someone else who doesn't respect their identity.
Yeah, this is such a good question. And a lot of people have really strong feelings about group work. So I want to call that out there. There's some people who really feel strongly that students should be assigned groups, that you collect information about students and try to pair them in a certain way. There's other folks that feel strongly it should be randomized. Based on work that I've done with folks, we've identified that group work in active learning courses can be especially problematic for LGBTQ students because we're asking them to work with people and those people may not make them feel comfortable with their identity. Far more than a traditional lecture where a student can just sit there and just be invisible. Group work, often what happens is you work on that problem, right? And then you're done, but then other people are still working. And so then the conversation goes into what are you doing this weekend? Potentially, who are you dating? It gets into problems of LGBTQ individuals are faced with, do I conceal my identity? Do I reveal my identity? Will this person accept my identity? And that just adds a whole extra layer of cognitive load for them. So that doesn't mean I don't think we should do group work. I think we should still do group work. I think that there are still lots of benefits for group work and active learning, but it means that we have to be more thoughtful about these interactions, exactly as this question raised. So again, I would highlight the need for inclusive classroom spaces, being explicit about this, highlighting that we expect students in groups to be respectful of each other, make it more normal that people can reveal their identities, right? And then for me, because of the data that we've shown that LGBTQ individuals can be worried about who they're working with, I let students choose their own groups. So when we've talked to LGBTQ students, they talk about how they beeline their way to someone who looks more gender nonconforming. They find that student who they think may also be a member of the LGBTQ community, because then they'd be more comfortable sharing their identity. And really importantly, we found that if students feel like they can actually share their identity and bring their whole self to that group discussion, then they could actually have a better situation, right? They could have a better discussion. They could go on to form kind of, study groups that they work on outside of class, and all of these things can be really positive for that student if they feel like they can actually reveal their identity. And then something also important as kind of a secondary point that we found, particularly for transgender students that need to establish pronouns, can be exhausting, right? Especially if groups change and they're having to work with new people and they're having to kind of reestablish their pronouns and debate whether or not they want to take up that time correcting people for misgendering them or actually thinking about the biology content. So I would also encourage that you create groups or that you let students choose their own groups, and then those groups stay constant and that they can correct people as far as those pronouns in the very beginning, but then those individuals can hopefully use the right pronouns.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I echo the same types of sentiments from my own classroom experiences to Sarah, with letting them choose their own groups and letting those groups persist. And what I've noticed in my own classrooms are the LGBTQ students grouping together and staying together and really helping to support each other in the classroom. Let's see. So, LGBTQ plus terminology continually advances due to our better understandings and conceptions of gender identity, romantic identity, etc. Are there terms that your team would include now on your list? Are there any definitions that you may change with how quickly things are changing and advancing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And you know, when we were putting together this list, we looked at a bunch of other lists that have already been created. And so we don't mean that our list of terms is meant to be, you know, all inclusive of every term. The language will change over time. I just last night re-looked through the list. I can't think of anything that I would include now that we didn't include at that point, but I will say that that list was influenced by our author team. And so, you know, presumably if we had had 20 extra people on the author team, they might have advocated for different terms, right? So again, that's just meant to be the beginning point. But, you know, if you just look up, you know, if you just Google search LGBTQ terminology, you'll see a bunch of lists of common terms. And that's just important because there are special terms associated with this identity. So specifically a term that I had no idea about before I actually started really thinking through this identity. I identify as gay, but transgender individuals have dead names, right? The name that they're born with that they no longer use. I didn't know the term dead name before actually starting to better educate myself with the transgender student experience. And it's really important to not use people's dead names, right? And that can be really challenging with, you know, with courses where we ask students to, you know, email with their university email, which may not be the name that they actually want to use, right? So I would encourage folks to kind of continually to continually kind of educate themselves. And then I also think that it's important to, you know, you can highlight to folks, you know, that you're going to try. And if you make a mistake, like, let me know, right? If I'm using a term that's potentially offensive or that offends someone in some way, just let me know, right? And I can try to correct that.
Thank you for that. The next question here, this one's more about LGBTQ safe spaces. So at my son's university, a pre-registration survey asked if he wanted a gender-neutral space. His inclination was to answer yes. However, as a cis heterosexual male, he recognized that his presence may actually harm the dynamics of the group, and this poses an ally conundrum. So how can students help foster inclusivity without necessarily intruding on LGBTQ plus safe spaces?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question. Because, and I think that the inclination that invading that space might be problematic is probably a good one. I know that, you know, so LGBTQ individuals have to come out, right? And we often say just like they have to come out once, but that's not the case, right? You have to come out repeatedly throughout your life, every day, every new person, every kind of interaction. In some ways you have to come out, but you know, there, for a lot of LGBTQ individuals, there's a point of their life. For some people, this is a short amount of time. For some people, it's a really long amount of time where they have acknowledged that they are LGBTQ themselves, but they haven't revealed that to the, you know, to the broader public. And as they start to go through that coming out process, they may start to tell a couple people, close friends, right? Close people to them that they think will be accepting. And then they'll start to kind of broaden that out. And there may be a phase where they're willing to be out to some kind of LGBTQ group, but they're not willing to be out to a broader network of folks. This was actually me in graduate school. I wasn't out to my graduate mentor, I wasn't out to my lab, but I was out to, you know, my friends who were members of the LGBTQ community, and I would go to like events as part of the LGBTQ community. So I think it is important to think about these spaces just because someone might feel uncomfortable if they're interacting with someone who they don't necessarily know if they would share and broadcast that information. But I don't have so I think it's a inclination. I think that it's a hard question to address in terms of what exactly to do, because everyone's going to feel a little bit different in terms of their comfort.
Yeah.
I don't know, Paul, if you have anything to add on to that.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I was thinking the same ways. Also being part of the LGBTQ plus community, there's this sense of almost battle fatigue of always, like you said, having to continually come out and just having that space where having that space where you can authentically be yourself and feel safer, I think, is really important. And sometimes those spaces are just for those individuals, and being able to understand that, I think, is really important because and it's more than just school, right? Like there's also a family dynamic. So um, uh, it's multiple fronts, and I think that having this space and being conscientious that it's space for individuals of certain identities is really important.
Yeah, we've interviewed LGBTQ grad students, and they've talked explicitly about how awesome it is to have like affinity groups or LGBTQ specific groups for professional societies where, if they're at the conference, exactly as Paul mentioned, they're almost having to debate whether or not they reveal their identity, they don't, and then there can be this group of folks that they can feel just more authentic with, and that they can share similar kind of challenges and frustrations. And so I think creating those spaces can be really helpful. And ASCB does this, SABR has this affinity group. And so, organizations are starting to do this.
To go along with the allyship that we were talking about earlier on, the allyship is a continual journey, and there may be instances of unintentional microaggressions, or maybe improper use of different terms, pronouns. What are some hints and lessons that you would share with allies who may experience something where they use the wrong pronouns or they use the wrong terminology?
Yes, this is something that our group spent a long time talking about, because, I think what often happens is an ally makes a mistake. And I think it's also really important to realize that there is a spectrum of identities within the LGBTQ community, right? And so just because someone's a member of the LGBTQ community, it doesn't mean they're not going to misgender individuals. It doesn't mean they're not going to have microaggressions towards other individuals, right? So if someone identifies as gay or lesbian, they may say derogatory things about bisexual individuals, right? They may say derogatory things about transgender individuals or asexual individuals, right? And so it's not just this isn't just a problem of ally versus LGBTQ community, but it can also be kind of anyone. So I think that, when people make mistakes, often they want to make just a really big deal about, oh, I'm so sorry, like, I needed to do better, blah, 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 blah. And what some individuals, particularly transgender individuals who get misgendered, have experienced was then it almost puts the burden on them to like reassure the person that it's okay, that they know that they're trying. And so it's really important that we don't do that, right? If we make a mistake, a quick sorry, like, I'm really sorry I did that, and then move on and be really like thoughtful about making sure to use the right pronoun the next time, right? And this can be really challenging, especially if you knew someone in a particular context and then they transition and then they're using a different pronoun, and just what's rote memory for you is that other pronoun. And so you have to make that extra effort, right? And so you almost need to think about tricks that you can use to just make sure that you're going to use the right pronoun, right? And if this is on Zoom, right, just normalize everyone putting their pronouns behind their name on Zoom, right? And so then it's just there and it is a reminder for you, right? And so I think that that's just something really important to realize, that when you make a mistake, don't put the burden back on that other person to make you feel better for making the mistake.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I agree with not making a big deal either, because I've been in the same instance where I know individuals who have transitioned where I accidentally use an improper pronoun where I say he, and then I just quickly correct myself, I mean she, and then you just move on with the conversation. Like you said, not making a big deal out of it. This
And
next,
it also goes, so I think one other thing to kind of build onto this is that, some individuals, people suspect that they're a member of the LGBTQ community. Some individuals based on how they dress or their kind of physical appearance, you wouldn't have kind of any idea that they're a member. Be really careful about what your reaction is, right? Because if you make the kind of, oh my gosh, I never thought that you'd be a part of the LGBTQ community, I totally thought you were straight, like that kind of overt reaction is not good, right? It makes that individual, it can make that individual feel just totally marginalized and that they have to almost prove their identity. And then even the reverse, right? If someone reveals their LGBTQ identity to you, and you're like, oh yeah, I knew for like years, that also potentially doesn't make that person feel better. So just be thoughtful about, these are often really difficult conversations, right? And most people that I've interacted who are members of the LGBTQ community, coming out, like especially in the very beginning of the first couple people you're coming out to or coming out professionally, it's really hard, right? And so just be thoughtful that your response, that they may be kind of really sensitive to whatever your response is, and so just be, I don't know, just careful how you respond to that.
Thank you for sharing that too. Let's see. Then our next question is in the context of online groups. So whenever we're talking about online courses, groups where students don't know each other as well, maybe not see or hear each other, how would you go about establishing groups and classroom dynamics that are more comfortable for LGBTQ plus students?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I would say a lot of us defaulted to just kind of the random Zoom groups, right? But that exactly, students are not going to be able to do that kind of surveying the class and see where they should actually sit. So you may think about, whether you want to ask students, if, about their identities and then potentially assign students based on their identities. I don't know, right? I think that's a lot of work on instructors' part, and then B, in the ideal world, we want individuals to be able to interact with a bunch of other people, right? And feel comfortable interacting with a bunch of other people. And so, yes, so I'm not sure what the best approach would be for that. I mean, at a minimum, we should normalize having students put their pronouns after their names. The other thing to think about is, do you require students to show their video cameras or not, right? Or do you give students the opportunity to just not have their video camera on if they're still able to verbally engage in the group? And so I might encourage you to think through that.
Let's see. The next question we have is about intersectionality. So how can we address intersectionality between things such as race, socioeconomic background, the gender identity, so that it feels more interwoven in our curriculum?
Yeah, this is a really great question. So I don't feel like I have really the expertise or the time to be able to really address it. But obviously the experiences of someone who's a cisgender gay man is very different than a woman of color who identifies as bisexual, right? And so the reality is that, especially as you compound identities that are potentially marginalized, people's experiences are different. There's also different reactions in different cultural groups to LGBTQ individuals, right? And acceptance of LGBTQ individuals. There's also a strong intersection between, religious identity versus LGBTQ identity, right? And so, so I think that this is something that we have to think about. I think it's something that we have to explore. People are not doing that at this point. I think largely because there's so little work just on LGBTQ individuals alone. But I hope that other folks will think about starting to explore some of these phenomenon.
And I think in terms of the classroom, what I typically do during the first couple of class meetings is really address intersectionality and recognizing that it is a thing, and then knowing that, like, for example, the experiences of being Black and the experiences of being female maybe are a woman may be different than the experiences of being a Black woman, and really having students understand that it's a mixture of all of these identities that end up creating our classroom experiences, and just being very thoughtful and intentional about recognizing that there are intersections of identities whenever we walk into a classroom.
Yeah, and I think one thing to build on to that is, we often like to put people in buckets, right? And we often like to look at the average experience of those people in buckets, right? And I think for all of these identities, and I think intersectionality plays into this, everyone's experience is is different, right? Their experience with their families are different. Their experiences in their professional like networks are different, right? Their own personal journey of acceptance of LGBTQ identity. A lot of folks grow up, you know, feeling homophobic internally, right? And so there becomes this process of self-acceptance. So everyone's experience is slightly different. So just because you know someone who's had one experience, that can't necessarily translate to other folks, even who have the exact same set of identities.
Thank you for that. So we're at about 5 minutes left. So what I would like to do is we would like to ask all of our attendees to use the chat window in order to share, I think it was share one thing that they learned in the webinar as kind of feedback for us. Yes. So as an assessment for us, please use the chat box to write one interesting thing you learned during today's session. And the other thing that we wanted to let you all know is this is actually we're actually going on a brief summer hiatus. So Online with LSE will be back during the fall. So please make sure to keep an eye out in your emails whenever we start back up. And Sarah, there were a few questions in the chat window about dropping the link for the new NSF study on LGBTQ plus instructors, if you don't mind dropping that in the chat window as well.
Absolutely. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and then so if folks want to hang on, I'll drop some of those links. So I'm dropping a link in there. This is Bryce Hughes' study showing that LGBTQ individuals don't persist. This is Aaron Chesh's study showing about systemic inequalities for LGBTQ professionals in STEM. This is a study that Katie Cooper and I have done looking at the experiences of LGBTQ individuals in active learning classrooms. So those of you who are interested in group work, that might be really helpful. And then here's the actual link to the 14 recommendations that we just kind of presented on. And then I'll go ahead and again share the QR code if anyone is interested in participating in our study. And I'll hang out if anyone has kind of any further questions that you want to put in the chat, I can address.